The 18th annual State of the River report was released last Tuesday, and it reveals a range of concerns from persistent sewage pollution to rising rates of salinity, algae blooms, and some pharmaceuticals. Here to talk about the ongoing challenges to keep the lower St. Johns River Basin clean is Lisa Reineman, the St. Johns River Keeper. Lisa, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning, Ann.
In just a few minutes, we're going to be joined by Dr. Jerry Pinto. He's an associate research scientist at Jacksonville University, one of the report's authors. And he is just running a few minutes late, so he's going to join us in progress. Lisa, I saw one description in this, in a summary of this river report that called it a complex picture of health, which I thought was an interesting phrasing and perhaps, the most positive light to say. But I mean, granting that the picture is complex, are there elements of this river system that you describe as healthy?
Oh, that's a challenging question. The river itself is complex. When you have a river with an 8,800 square mile watershed, there are lots of threats. There's lots of different nuances to the river's health. And so it is very hard to point to one thing that's doing really well. But the good thing is you do have people paying attention to it. And that's one of the values of this river report is really understanding how all these complexities work with one another. We are seeing some improvement in some areas with nutrient pollution, but then we see other areas where it's increasing. And when a significant amount of nutrient pollution comes from outside the lower basin, it underscores the importance of looking at this data and figuring out, most importantly, how do we do something with it to make sure that we are protecting this river for future generations.
You talk about the size of the watershed. Mm-hmm. So for people who aren't familiar with just the definition of the lower St. Johns River Basin, remind us where we're talking about.
Yeah, so the lower St. Johns River is the last 100 miles of the St. Johns. Since the river flows north, it begins its 310-mile journey in Indian River County, and it flows north, and right where the Ocklawaha River meets the St. Johns, just south of Willatka, that's the beginning of the lower St. Johns River watershed. And so it's that last 100 miles of the St. Johns from Willatka all the way up to Mayport where it meets the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, and so you're talking about sort of in the counties, Volusia, Putnam area, and then north.
Absolutely. So you have Putnam County, you have Volusia County, Putnam County, St. Johns, Clay, Duval, as well as parts of Nassau County.
Yeah.
And so all that flows into it. And it's about the watershed. You can't look at the health of the St. Johns River without really looking at the health of all the tributaries and everything that feed into the St. Johns, because that's part of this river system.
And that's a big part of the findings of this report, because the main stem of the river, which is what we think of the river covered by the bridges,
right?
That is doing somewhat better. And the increasing problem of all of the various metrics, and we'll get into those, really does seem to be in the tributaries. And that's, obviously a huge part of this watershed.
Absolutely. It is. It's more, it's more dire in the tributaries, but we also see some slippery issues with the main stem itself, with increasing nutrient pollution coming from upstream, as well as the increase in salinity and the wide variety of fresh saltwater spikes in the St. Johns.
We are now joined by Dr. Gerald Pinto. I'm glad to have you here. Thank you so much for coming in this morning, sir.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to ask you a little bit about just the big picture of this report, because we said at the top, this is the 18th year of this report. You have been working on water issues far longer than that in this area. Decades now. And so if you just had to summarize kind of the trajectory that you've seen in that time, how do you think we're doing?
That's a question I get a lot. And it's not easy to answer because we have this thing called shifting baselines. So throughout this continuum of time, things have been changing in the river. Things have been changing population-wise. Technology-wise, a lot of different ways, development-wise. The pressures on the resources, natural resources, have increased considerably. So all those kinds of things put pressure on the river. And so if you were to ask, how was the river 50 years ago, we had raw sewage flowing into the river. Now we don't, so that's a good thing. But we've had a massive increase in population, human population. We all contribute nutrient streams, believe it or not, to our wastewater treatment plants. And so those things add to the system as nutrients. in some form or another after they've been cleaned or not. And so, we're doing okay in some areas, but we have to be very careful going forward. We don't want something happening in the river that happened in the Indian River Lagoon recently, where we saw the ecosystem pretty much collapse because of nutrient pollution. So we have to be wary of that going forward. And this is a problem that many cities, many urban areas, many places around the world are suffering with.
So I think I hear you saying that there have been improvements in terms of the way that we treat the river, the way that we treat things that go into the river. But overall, the health of the river continues to be impaired because of the additional stresses. Has it gotten overall worse?
In some cases, it has. We're seeing more algae blooms. That's an indicator that there's a lot more nutrients going into the system that are feeding these algae blooms. We have, you talked about pharmaceuticals that are appearing in the water. Normally, a good wastewater treatment system plant will remove those things. So you have to ask yourself, how are they getting in the water? Obviously, they're human sources, and they must be coming from leaking somewhere. And so we have this huge septic tank problem in our municipality. 60,000 septic tanks, 40,000 of which have been deemed necessary to be removed. And we have some projects ongoing on the north side to remove some. But we're really at the beginning stages of removing those or connecting those up to the sewage system. And so that's a major concern right there.
In terms of pharmaceuticals, you say a good water treatment system should remove those. Do we know if our water treatment systems here are removing those?
They should be. I mean, the amount of, the level of water treatment that our Buckman plant and other plants do, they should be able to remove those.
Okay, and so you're thinking is
So
that
I'm thinking leaking septic tanks, maybe failure of pipes, old infrastructure, breaking down. These are sources where leaks can occur. We've had sanitary sewer overflows this past year that are lower than in past years, but those spills can be from 1 gallon to 100,000 gallons. Actually, we had a 100,000 gallon spill last year. And so those are big problems.
and I think we have an image that shows the number and the intensity of sanitary sewage overflows in the system for the last several years that people who are watching our live stream can see. But that does continue to be a problem. In addition to the leaking septics. If you're just joining us, we are talking to Jacksonville University marine science researcher Dr. Jerry Pinto and riverkeeper Lisa Reineman about the findings of the newly released St. John's River, the State of the River report. You can join the conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937, or you can go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways you can connect with us. We've got a call from Mark in St. Augustine. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
Hey, I've been pessimistic about the river for decades now. There's nothing we can do when we've got 10,000 people moving into Jacksonville every day or every week or some crazy number like that. We continue to let developers build new housing subdivisions with septic systems. I mean, we're taking a few, hundreds or maybe 1,000 old leaky septic systems offline, but we're replacing them with 5,000 more. Also, I would like to know and let's not forget that Orlando is sucking, 10 million gallons of St. John's River water every day to water their golf courses. Everybody seems to have forgotten that. But I want to know, my question is, I hear some talk that they are finally going to decommission the Rodman Reservoir. Will that do anything to improve the condition of the St. John's River?
Many good questions there, Mark. Lisa Reineman, obviously, let's start with the Rodman, because that is an issue you've worked on for many, many years to try to remove the Kirkpatrick Dam from the Rodman Reservoir and restore the Ocklawaha River as it flows into the St. John's.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something been decades in the making, to breach the dam to allow a free-flowing Ocklawaha River to reunite Silver Springs, the Ocklawaha, and the St. John's. That decision is still being made in Tallahassee. Most likely there'll be legislation, this legislative session that begins in January.
And it passed last year, right?
It was put in the appropriations bill, and so it
And
did not.
vetoed
It
by the
was
governor?
vetoed by the governor, and so this year it seems like the energy around is going to legislation. So there'll be active committee meetings, opportunities for Mark and others to weigh in to make sure that this happens, because it is very important to the health of the Lower St. Johns River. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to undo all the harms that we need to work together to make sure we're working on to restore. But it will replenish the St. Johns River with 150 million gallons of fresh water every day. Some of that will come from restored springs as well as loss of evaporation. So that'll help offset some of the saltwater intrusion issues I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment. Also, it has 7,000 plus acres of forested floodplain that will be restored. Those type of wetlands are the best biofilters, so that'll help filter out pollution, and it really helps restore submerged grasses downstream, which are the kidneys of the St. Johns, not to mention all the impacts to our fisheries by allowing more migratory pathways to open up. And so it's multifaceted, the impacts, and you can find out more information at reunitethерivers.com.
Yeah. Dr. Pinto, we talked about, I want to talk more about nutrient pollution in a minute and really explain what that is and where it's coming from, the primary sources. But there are other challenges to the river, including, inputs of pollution, specific contaminants. Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of contaminants? We mentioned pharmaceuticals. That's one kind. What are some of the other ones that this report looks at?
So I'll start off by saying that that's not really my area of expertise. We have Dr. Gretchen Billmeyer, who's the environmental toxicologist who handles that section of the report. But we have contaminants that are things like metals, heavy metals, cadmium, mercury, lead, nickel, zinc, aluminum, and these tend not to be much of a problem in the main stem of the river, more so in the tributaries. One of the biggest problems, though, with the metal information is that we have very limited data, particularly in the tributaries on metals. If you look at, for example, I think it's nickel, there were 300 and something readings of nickel taken in the past, but only in the last 5 years that's down to maybe 30 to 40. So almost a tenfold change has occurred in actual monitoring of these sorts of things. So metals is one thing. Metals in the sediments, metals in the water column. We also look at organochlorine pesticides and total pesticides in the water column. And those have increased over the years quite a lot.
Yeah.
Particularly, we also look at things like PCBs, and these are long-lived chemicals that are, as individuals, there's a whole stream of them. If you add them all up, the cumulative effect is much higher than the thresholds, water quality criteria. And those are things that do not degrade. I mean, they're in the sediments, and when you do things like dredging, or you have storms that whip up the system, stir things up, those things get resuspended, and of course they're a problem. And they tend these metals and these pesticides and things tend to bioaccumulate up the food chain as well. So they're affecting the organisms in the river. They're affecting what eats those, and then eventually humans at some point are consuming some of the fish in there that may have accumulated some of these things.
We have a call from Juanita on the south side. Good morning, Juanita. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for your services, Lisa and Dr. Pinto. I wanted to find out, I did listen to the State of the River report, and I wanted to find out more information on the finding that there were E. coli that was present in the Julington and Durban Creeks area. However, there were only small samples taken, so there wasn't any conclusory determination there. Why was there not more sampling done in those areas if E. coli was in fact found there?
That's a very good question, Juanita. Do you have an answer for that, Dr. Pinto?
Yeah, this is not uncommon to other tributaries as well. We have a huge area that the agencies are trying to cover, DEP measuring these things, bacteria levels. And so what we've tended to do over the years is sort of spot check. So that's a very limited number of samples in many different areas to cover this massive, massive watershed. And when something is discovered, usually there's more emphasis and focus in that area and more samples are taken there. So if you look at the data over time, there are some tributaries that have good data or more data, and then there are other tributaries that don't have very much at all. And so in an analysis of that, this year, Dr. Scott Jones from UNF has looks at that section in terms of water quality and nutrients, and has kind of done an analysis where we look at the wet season and the dry season and how that affects those things. But generally speaking, when a problem is discovered, then more emphasis is directed there. The problem is that we have so many tributaries, and we have sort of a very spot-checking way of doing that we don't have accurate data or the same amount of data in all these areas.
And for folks who are watching our live stream, we have a graphic that was part of this report that shows 23 major waterways that are considered impaired, basically not attaining standards under existing law, meaning they're not safe for swimming, fishing, or wildlife. And that includes so many tributaries, but really ones, Lisa, that are iconic. Julington Creek is on that, Ribault River, the Broward River, the Trout River, Cedar River. So when we think of tributaries, these aren't little tiny creeks. These are major waterways that people are recreating on. They're playing in, they're fishing in, often despite warnings to not fish in these areas. I mean, there's a picture that appeared in the Times-Union not long ago of someone sitting on the bank with a fishing pole in the water right next to a sign that warned of the hazards.
Yeah, and there's even a lack of signage. One of the challenges here, as Dr. Pinto mentioned, we don't have enough data, and so we really need more information. And there's also lack of signage on some of the tributaries that are polluted and telling people not to fish and swim because the health agencies say, well, there's not enough data. So we're sort of in this spiral of not having enough information to really identify the sources, to do something about it, to clean up these creeks, and to warn the public to make sure that they're remaining healthy. We're in ongoing conversations working with the health department to try to make sure that we're letting people know, but also we as an organization, St. John's Riverkeeper, we've started collecting more data in Ribault River and Moncrief Creeks, really honing in on an area to see if what can we do to make sure we're not spreading the information too thin, and honing in to figure out what's really happening and where is it coming from, and hoping to use that project as a pilot to do more of it. Because I think one of the things the River Report tells us every year is we simply don't have enough information, and we're seeing cuts every day at our agencies where we get less information. And until we have data to really make sure we're making the right decisions for investment, we're going to be spinning our wheels and seeing increases in pollution across the board.
We've got a call from Denise in Mayport. Good morning, Denise. Go ahead.
Hi, Lisa, I just tuned in, so you may have addressed this, but I thought you participated in a study aboard the MRZ with some students analyzing plant life along the river. And if I'm correct, did that study indicate how plant life may have been affected by pollution?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for that question, Denise, and I haven't covered it. One of the things that St. John's Riverkeeper launched in 2023 was a Save Our Rivers Grasses expedition. Because one of the things we see in the River Report every year, we're losing our submerged aquatic vegetation. It's really the canary in the coal mine. These submerged grasses, they're the kidneys of the St. Johns River, as well as their critical fish habitat. So our commercial and recreational fisheries depend on them. And we've seen a significant loss since Hurricane Irma. And the bigger problem is they're not coming back. And so we launched a 5-year program. We just finished up year 3 to study what's going on with our grasses over an 80-mile section of the lower St. Johns River. And also, what can we do about it? How can we work towards solutions, meeting with agencies, elected officials, fishermen, and using that data to really make sure we're looking at real solutions. And the 2025 report will be out later this year. And then we'll be hosting a series of meetings up and down the lower St. John's to discuss the health and the state of the submerged grasses, and most importantly, what can we do about it?
We had a question, Dr. Pinto, that raised the issue of, why aren't we doing more testing? And I guess when it comes to the issue of Julington Creek and the presence of E. coli, I guess one of my thoughts is it's so prevalent. it may not even really send up a flag for people who are doing the testing, because is there really a tributary in St. John's in the lower basin that doesn't have E. coli concern levels? And that's, I just want to ask as a second part, kind of, what is the situation when it comes to funding for testing of water quality?
Well, I don't really know what the situation for funding is, but it's never been sufficient to cover what needs to be done, and I don't think it ever will be. But it will. But we can focus in areas where we're identifying hotspots, and so yes, I mean all our tributaries, pretty much all 60 something of them that have been looked at, have exceedances of the water quality criteria. There are a few that are mentioned in the river report. Just offhand, I can't remember all of them, but places like Miller Creek, a couple of sub-tributaries in the Arlington River. Just to mention a few, Cowpen Creek, there are a few of them that are over 100% exceeding the water quality criteria, and they haven't changed in a while. They're still very high. So those are sort of problem areas that we can identify. Now we have to find out, what are the sources and how to address those sources. But they have been a problem for a while. But generally speaking, the septic tank removal process, or the hooking up to the sewer system, is sort of just at the beginning stages. This is a massive effort that will take billions of dollars, eventually to complete. But you mentioned earlier, one of the big problems is we keep permitting septic tanks, and I admit that in some places there is no sewer, and you have to have some kind of on-site treatment like that. But the latest technology and better inspection and keeping up with those things and fixing them when they leak or when there's a problem with them is going to be critical.
We know, Lisa, that the septic situation is a problem, and it is all over the state. And so moving to sewage treatment and a more kind of, organized system of disposing of sewage is the solution. And yet we know, and Riverkeeper has been very active in trying to hold to account the issue of sanitary sewer overflows. We see those a lot during storms. Again, that's something that this report tracks, but those can have enormous volume impacts on the watershed and really impair water quality in the short and long term. So how do you view this transition from septic to sewer in terms of the presence of things like E. coli or pharmaceuticals or other things that are rooted in human waste?
Yeah, it's really problematic because, quite honestly, we have a significant problem with our overall sewage plan for the state of Florida. When you have a state that's growing as quickly as the state of Florida in our watershed, you really need to have a sustainable long-term plan to manage that growing volume of human waste. And right now, state policy is actually encouraging, incentivizing, and permitting South Florida to send their biosolids, the byproduct for treating sewage at wastewater treatments, to the headwaters of the St. John's. So at the same time, we're trying to get money to take septic tanks offline, send them to a wastewater treatment facility. If we're just taking the sludge, the byproduct that's only partially treated, and disposing it on land in our watershed, we're just playing whack-a-mole with this sewage, and we're basically undermining the river's health, as well as undermining that public investment that Dr. Pinto mentioned that needs to happen to get these septic tanks offline. So we're just again playing whack-a-mole if we don't make sure that when we send sewage to the wastewater treatment facilities, they have advanced treatment to make sure it's taking out all of the pharmaceuticals and nutrients that need to be, and that we're not just simply disposing of reclaimed water that may be adding more pollution to the problem if not treated properly, and then biosolids on land. It's just in a downward spiral that we have to correct. And that's going to take legislative action, and it's going to take local governments coming together to make sure we're protecting our public investment and our long-term health of the river and its tributaries.
And we've talked a little bit about the disposal of these biosolids, this wastewater treatment sludge, essentially, before. And, we most recently over the summer talked about this report that came out from a group called the Balmoral Group that found that cleaning up pollution from sewage sludge could cost over $1.2 billion in the next 4 decades. And that's kind of consistent with what has been shown to be the impacts of this South Florida ban on disposing of sewage sludge. So essentially, all of their sewage sludge is being trucked to areas in Central and North Florida,
That's right.
including around the headwaters of the St. Johns River, which, as we know, flows north. And
Right,
so those
right.
pollution elements just come north.
Absolutely. And so, you have elected officials in Indian River County, Brevard County, and Osceola County all coming together to try to stop this practice because this is happening in their counties and they haven't really had a say on what happens. And then all of this is coming downstream. About 80% of the nitrogen reduction that needs to happen in the lower St. Johns is from upstream sources, as well as about more than half of the phosphorus. And so, even though we've made some progress in the lower basin, there's more pollution coming if we don't try and change the state policy. Luckily, there is legislation, but it's not perfect yet. So there will be an active biosolids discussion in Tallahassee in January and February.
And the legacy of these biosolid, the impact, Dr. Pinto, those are things that even if we were to stop dumping biosolids, around the headwaters of the St. Johns River today, there would be ongoing impacts that even might intensify just because of the legacy of that dumping. Or,
Yes.
or I shouldn't say dumping. I mean, it is a land application. It's used as a fertilizer in agricultural settings, right?
Well, yes, that's true. And I mean, the soils that those are applied to will of course become logged, fully water. I mean, not waterlogged, but they will become um, very
Saturated.
saturated with that material. A lot of phosphorus is in it too. A lot of heavy metals, PFAS, all these kinds of things, because those types of biosolids are not really clean to what we call the AA standard, which is turned into a commercial fertilizer, and you're able to use it as fertilizer. But the other ones are not clean to that level, and so all those things will eventually leach into waterways. Particularly talking about nutrients, almost soon after this practice started, water management districts started noticing increasing phosphorus levels in the water. And those are only going to continue to increase over time. We have rising water levels, rising water tables. The way that those biosolids are applied, there is a strict protocol, but we don't know how well it's being enforced. And problems with that can exacerbate this situation for sure.
There
Yeah.
are a few positives in this report, and I feel like it would be unfair to not talk about some of those. There have been a few species that are doing better in the watershed, including the return of the short-nosed sturgeon. Wood storks are doing better. Bald eagles are doing better. How much can we take from those few positives in terms of the overall future and the state of the river?
Yeah, well, there is some bright news. I mean, I will say the data on sturgeon is very limited, but we have better data on wood storks and bald eagles and manatees that were once endangered are now threatened, and some have been delisted, like the bald eagle. But if you track those populations, the long-term trends are good for them. They're up still. Although if you look more recently, since the Hurricane Irma anyway, bald eagles and wood storks took a big hit because their habitat was affected, but if you look at them in the last couple of years, they're starting to go back up again. And so that's a good sign. But the general long-term trends are up, so that's a good sign.
If there was one thing that either of you could just today, make a single change to an input or a cause of harm to the St. Johns River, what would you prioritize first?
Well, we talked about the dire straits of our grass beds, the submerged aquatic vegetation in the river. That's really important habitat. I mean, it only represents a small amount of the actual total area, but it's very critical for a lot of wildlife. Manatees use it. Birds, fish use it as habitat. Our blue crab fishery is the biggest in the river. They use those grass beds at certain times. So that it's critical to try to understand why those are disappearing in certain parts. We've found out that, as I said before, that it's a dynamic system. So in the north, it's very much salinity stressed, and that's why the grasses don't grow well there. That's been occurring over time because of dredging and saltwater pushing further into the river, also because of sea levels rising. In the southern part of our basin, you have increased color in the water, so that diminishes the amount of light that the plants get. But also you have increased water levels now too, so that also decreases the amount of light that the plants get. Some of those plants are getting less than 40% of the light that they used to get. And so when they're small and they're trying to recover, it's very much harder. And so I will say that, we've lost grasses in certain parts, particularly in the north. It's coming back in certain patches, but the general picture is pretty dire right now, and we need to find a way to rejuvenate that habitat, which brings me back to the Ocklawaha, which is the biggest tributary to the St. Johns River, provides or historically provided 40% of the freshwater input into the river, and how restoring that flow to its natural flow would enhance the system, would provide more of the kidneys of the environment to clean the wetlands. You talk about 7,000 acres of wetlands. Freshwater inputs are very important into an estuary. And so I think that would be, the key thing, I think I would say, would be getting that
Restore
input
the river.
restored.
Yeah.
And I would echo that. Definitely reuniting Silver Springs, the Ocklawaha, and the St. Johns would have a significant boost to the long-term health of the St. Johns River and its fisheries. But I'd also say we have to have a sustainable plan for ongoing management of sustainable management of our growing volume of human waste. We cannot continue to play whack-a-mole with our growing amount of sewage. And I think that that's something we need to all come together to have a cleaner St. Johns and tributaries.
Well, we know that this report is going to be presented in more detail on February 13th at the Environmental Symposium. I trust that you both will be there. But it's great to speak to you this morning, Dr. Jerry Pinto, Lisa Reineman, the Riverkeeper. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.